Can a person do that while remaining comfortable? Or is comfort is that our cancer of the 21st century? And I say that jokingly, but my wife is an author and she writes about the Dust Bowl, and I don't want to live in that time period, right? The Great Depression, all that. But gosh, we've made the most comfortable society in human history ever, ever, ever. And what you're talking about is profoundly uncomfortable.
Yes. Well, when we're comfortable, we rarely change. Everybody wants a better life. No one wants to change.
Right. I want to be in great shape. I just don't want to work out, right?
Exactly right.
Yes.
That's how it works. But here's what I can tell you about history. I'm a student of patterns. When people go like, what's the future going to be like? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Well, I'm not just an optimist to be an optimist. I believe in intelligence. I believe in seeing things as they are, not worse than it is, though. Yeah, and then I believe seeing it better than it is, because without a vision, people perish. It says in a very good book.
Right.
A good book. And then you got to make it that way. You got to have the strategies to make it that way. So that's kind of my mindset with it. But part of what makes me confident is studying history. It's like I tell, one day I remember, I have 5 kids and 5 grandkids, and I have, my 3.5-year-old daughter, my 50-year-old daughter. I mean, it's quite a range. And,
well, I complain. I have a 14-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I complain, and I'm done complaining effective immediately, because that's a gap, brother. That's a gap.
That's a gap. But I have more skills today. But what I think of my grandkids and my daughter, my youngest daughter today, and I go, we all know that with AI, with robotics, with nanotechnology, there's going to be more change in the next 10 years than the previous 1,000. The tempo is going to explode. It's already exploding, but we're at the base of that growth pattern, right? So 40% of the jobs we have right now are going to be gone. Well, that's not a problem. We all used to be farmers, 150 years ago. 85% of America was farmers. Now it's 3%. We feed the whole world, right? But there was time to make those changes. So this is going to happen so fast. So it's like, what needs to be done? Well, everyone needs to learn 3 skills. If you want to have your kids do well, if you want to do well, number 1, you have to be good at pattern recognition. You're good at that, John, or you couldn't do what you do, right? You recognize patterns. That takes away fear. So when people look at things like, oh, it's the worst it's ever been, I go, you haven't studied history. You study 1,000 years of Roman history, 500 years of Anglo-American history, and you see there is a cycle, almost like seasons, that happens every 18 to 20 years, where there's a primary emotion, just like a season, and it controls how the majority of people think, not everybody. It's how people react to things. The same events are reacted to differently based on the season. And so when you recognize patterns, you're not fearful. Second step, though, is when you learn to use a pattern, you have power. So if you look at anybody that's a good dancer, good singer, someone who's run multiple businesses successfully, someone who's a great investor, which I spend my time studying those people, you'll discover that they don't recognize the patterns, they know how to use them. And then the third level is when you really begin to be a person who creates patterns. So it's like, if you want to play the piano, most of us first learn by playing someone else's pattern, someone who was really good that figured it out, right? We look at their pattern, we study their pattern, then we learn to use their pattern. And eventually, if you played enough other people's music, you create your own. That's what's happened in my life with all the skills I have. I'm standing on the shoulders, just like I'm sure you are, of all these great thinkers before us, but also then you bring your own music to it at that stage, right? When you start creating patterns, you have a tremendous amount of freedom in your life. So when I look at life and say, how is life and how are people going to do? I don't get overreactive to what happens in a single business. I have 114 companies now. We do $8 billion in business. I had no business background, but I studied patterns, and they're easy to study. Patterns in business and patterns of people. What happens is there's no fear when you recognize this. But look at humanity even just for a second. When did humanity go from living in fear of survival to being able to stay in one place and build a community and live the way we live today with communities and cities and states and countries? Well, it came from one pattern recognition that we figured out how to use, and it was the seasons. Before that, we were hunter-gatherers running around hoping we could find enough food and chasing the next place to go. That all changed when we realized there is the right time to plant. If you plant in the winter, I don't care how hard you work, you're not going to reap. It's not going to work. There's one season, and this is how it works. And then you got to defend it during the summer, and then you got to reap in the fall, and you got to save some of it for the winter, right? Well, when we learned that, humanity exploded. Now we run the planet, for good or bad, we run the planet. Well, similarly, there's a pattern in people's life. So all those listening right now are watching. They're in one of the seasons. If you're 0 to 21, you're in springtime. I'm making these numbers general,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Everybody's life slightly different. But what happens in that stage of life? Well, it's like if you start a business in an optimistic springtime, you think you're a genius because everybody's well in business in springtime. Everybody's optimistic, money's available, goes really well. Well, similarly, when you're a child, you're protected. Now, some of us had to go to work at 7 and 8 years old, but still you're overall protected. Someone looked out for you. If there's a war, you didn't go fight the war. You're being fed information. You're being taken care of to some extent, and you're learning. It's a learning process. Now, 22 to 42 is the summertime. That's the testing time. That's when you think you're invincible and you think you're going to be president of the United States, a multi-billionaire, and have 100 relationships simultaneously, and everyone's going to be happy. And you discover you can't even run one relationship by the time you're 30 or 35. And you discover you're not the president of the United States. And so now you realize you're not invincible. That range is you're the soldier of society. You're going to take what you learn and say, I don't know if I believe this. I'm going to test what I believe. I'm going to see what I try. I'm going to create my model of the world, right? You might duplicate what you learned. You might come up with something new, but it's a testing period. If we have a war, you're the ones that go to war, 22 to 42. That's who goes to war, right? So you're the soldier of business. You're the soldier of society. You're learning. You're growing. It's also the period of time where all studies show people are most unhappy because they're trying to prove themselves, trying to figure out who they are. They haven't figured out relationship yet. They haven't figured out their career yet, so forth. But if you keep growing through spring and summer, you get to the reaping time called fall, and that's 43 to 63. That 20-year period overall is when you'll earn the most, because if you grew during spring and summer, by this point, you know more people, you have more relationships. I'm sure, John, you can do more with your pinky now than you used to do working 20 hours a day. You might still work 20 hours a day, but you just do that much more. You can accomplish that much more. So you are the leaders of society. You're the engine of society. That's the power time. That's when you're going to have the greatest rewards potentially. But the ultimate rewards, and I can tell you because I'm there now, is 64 to 84 to 104 to 120. The oldest humans lived to 120. That's the winter time, but that's elderhood. That's where you really get to lead, where your leadership is because you're not trying to prove yourself to yourself or anybody else. You know that no matter who you are, I mean, if you're Jesus, people still going to try and not be happy with you. There's no one you're going to please everybody, right? If you don't have holes in your hand, you're not going to please everybody. Right. So after a while, you realize, it's not that you don't care. It's just that you don't care.
I don't care. Right.
You're here to serve. If people don't get it, it's okay. I don't have to have everybody understand. And so there's a different level of comfort in yourself. And you have relationships that are 20, 30, 40 years long. And you know who you are. And so now you feel like if you've taken care of your health at least, and you've done well in terms of your life, you have unlimited freedoms to do, share, create whatever you want. And it's like life is the greatest gift possible. So those are the stages. But there's also seasons of history. So think about it. We go through 20-year periods. So imagine, I'll just give you this one final metaphor. Imagine you're born in 1910, and you don't have to be a great historian to remember, okay, if I'm going to go the first season of spring, it's going to be 1910, 20 years roughly to 1930. Well, when those people were growing up, they were protected during World War I, looked out for. They didn't have to go through the war. The elders did. And then we had this great economic surge, right? The roaring 20s, new technology, airplanes, cars, TVs, radio, all at one time. People were partying like crazy. And that generation was originally called flappers because all they did was party. They didn't do squat. They were incredibly weak. You'll see where I'm going from where you started this question. Long way from it, but returning to it now. And what happened is, when they hit 1929, they thought 19 years old, I'm going to get a car. I'm going to party. I'm going to go out and have the time of my life. And what happened? Stock market drop, people jumping out of buildings, the middle of the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, people standing in line for bread, people trying to figure out how to survive. So a generation that was incredibly weak became strong because the times demanded it. That's what makes us strong. Going back to your original point. And then guess what? They went through 10 years of depression. Now, depression wasn't every moment. There were moments it was positive, 31, 32, and then it went back negative again. So when it's wintertime, there can be sunny days. Just the overall theme is fear and concern. But guess what? When they made it through all that, they made it to 29 years old, and it's 1939, and now World War II breaks out, and it looks like, none of us were alive back then, but those that were, look, Hitler was winning everywhere. In days, he was taking over countries. He's bombing London. I mean, it looked like the whole country, the whole world's going to hell. And the stock market drops through the floor, and these people volunteered and went to war and won. They fought and they won. They became known as the greatest generation. And when they came home, the season changed. Winter was over. They made it through 20 years. They're incredibly powerful, and good times were here. Think about how different the 50s were and the early 60s up until Kennedy was shot. Was a time of tremendous optimism in this country. And people, like, if you came back from the war, you were honored. If you came back for the war, you got the Viet loan, the veteran loan, and you went out and you got a home in the suburbs. And new technology made it easier to be home. And then guess what? After about 18 years, we get exhausted with the optimism, and we go through the summertime that tests us. Kennedy gets killed. Bobby Kennedy gets killed, Sr. Martin Luther King gets killed. And generationally, and this happens every 80 years like clockwork, that generation goes, I'm not going to war. Why should I go to war? That generation that was protected, right, by their parents that grew so much by pain. And so what they do, they went to college and they had love-ins and they said, you're all mean people and you think you're so great, but you don't treat black people well, you don't treat white people or women well, which is also true, by the way. But they saw what's missing because they were well-fed. They didn't have to go to war, right? They raised their children differently. They weren't there for their kids. They were off doing their thing, and their kids were latchkey kids, X generation. They came home and let themselves in the house and watched TV and figured out how to be independent. They developed a different mindset. So think of the 60s and 70s versus the 80s, 90s, 2000s, completely different way of being. One way to measure it is in college, they asked for 60 years. What's more important? A philosophy of life that makes you feel happy or the skills that make you financially independent? When they asked the 60s and 70s, 82% said, what would you guess? Philosophy or the skills?
Oh, it was like the philosophy. It was like
right.
I want to live a good life, right?
That's right. In the 80s, 90s, 2000s, guess what the answer is?
I want to make money.
Completely.
How do I make money? Yes.
That's right. Because they were raised differently.
What about me?
Right?
That's right.
And now we're turning back to winter, where people are fearful all the time, where the same events are interpreted like it could be the end of the world. But it isn't the end. It's just a change, a transformation. So these things have gone on forever. And when you see them, you start to realize that no war lasts forever, no pandemic lasts forever, no winter lasts forever. And by the way, some people freeze to death in winter. Other people get really strong. They learn to ski and snowboard and have a good time. They build their business, they build their family. And we're overall in a winter right now. But spring is coming. And how far are we in the winter? If you study historians, they think we might be 3/4 the way through it. There's still some winter to go through. There's still some economic challenges. There'd probably be some form of war, maybe cyber war with China or someone. But on the other side of that, people get tired of feeling that way, and they want that new springtime again. Those seasons are part of life. That is what people need to understand, is how to take advantage of the season they're in and not think that problems, most people's biggest problem is they think they shouldn't have any, when problems make us grow. So here's the last thing I'll say on that long tirade.
No, it's great, man. Thank you.
But here's the history of the world in 4 sentences. And it comes back to what you started this question with. Good times create weak people. They don't mean to be weak. They just don't know. They've never been tested. If you live in Florida, you think cold is 68 degrees, right? If you live in Minnesota, cold is -30. So you have no perspective here, right? So when you have good times, you don't get strong. By the way, if good times create weak people create bad times. Bad times create strong people. And strong people create great times, and then a cycle returns. That's the history of the world. So can we be optimistic about the future? Yes. And by the way, the the millennial generation, the Z generations that are looked down by Xers and baby boomers, like they're so weak and all that stuff, I have no worries about them. Yes, right now, some of them react like I have to have a trigger warning before you can talk about something, but that's not the majority of them. And because of winter, they will be tested. And when they're tested, they will grow, and they have great tools, great technology tools, great intelligence, great caring. They're going to be the next heroes of our generation, of the next generations.
Can you opt out of the cycle to create your own safe, and I don't mean that in a, the way it's been politicized, but create a thriving place inside of a cycle like that? Or do you have to just ride it out?
No, you look at winter. Like I just said, winter in Florida is different than winter in Minnesota.
There you go.
So you
yeah,
can,
that's a great. I grew up
be
in
in a
Texas.
location.
Yeah, so winter is
Yeah,
is
so
58 degrees. That's it. Yeah.
So so the truth of the matter is, I have a home in Fiji. I bought it so that all hell was breaking loose in the world. They're on a different cycle, but we're so connected as a world. It still affects everybody, but your level of cycle will be different. But the best answer is not to hope you get yourself in a good place. The best answer is get so strong that when winter comes, you're not complaining about it. You take advantage of it. If you look at the top 1,000 companies in the United States, the Fortune 1,000 in the world, I should say, 60% of them, they could be born in one of 4 seasons, but 60% of them were born in winter, meaning they came to life during the middle of a recession or a depression. It's mind-boggling, the biggest names. Why? Because if you do well in that season, you'll do well in every other season. So my lesson for people is, look, I know it seems really difficult right now. You need to create a compelling future. Anyone can deal with the difficult today if we have a compelling tomorrow.